My grandpa used to warn me to never speak of the Wailing Woman of Willow Creek. But with it being Halloween and all, I figured I'd pass along the legend. Just don't repeat what I'm about to say. The story takes place right here in our little town of Ashburg. Grandpa said the Wailing Woman used to roam these very woods we're camping in, back when he was a boy. Her cries could be heard for miles, echoing through the trees like a banshee's wail. Folks say she had long black hair that hung in front of her face and dragged on the ground. And her nails, oh, her nails were long yellow claws that could scratch the bark right off a tree. Now, Grandpa lived on a farm just north of town. His bedroom window looked out on the woods, and many nights he'd lay awake listening to that awful wailing coming from the trees. He said it sounded like the cry of a woman in mourning, just keening and moaning for hours on end. Sent chills down his spine. One night must have been midnight or so. Grandpa woke up to the wailing, only this time it sounded really close. He crept over to his window and peered out into the woods. The moon was full, lighting up the trees in a pale glow. He scanned the edge of the forest, looking for any sign of movement. That's when he saw her. I shuddered just thinking about it. There, under a large oak tree, stood an impossibly tall woman just wailing up at the night sky. Her black hair hung down past her knees in knotted strands. Grandpa squinted and could just make out her white gown fluttering in the breeze. He froze, unable to look away as she swayed and cried, her mourning cries getting louder and more anguished. Grandpa's eyes went wide as she slowly turned her head toward the house, toward him. Even from this distance, he could see her eyes, sunken and ringed in black. They stared right at him through strands of tangled hair. He stumbled back from the window, scrambling into bed and pulling the covers up over his head like a shield. The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of shuffling footsteps in the leaves. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Grandpa squeezed his eyes shut and held his breath. The footsteps came closer, accompanied by heavy breathing. He clenched his quilt tightly in his fists. Closer, closer. The breathing turned to wheezing. Something scratched at his window. I'm getting goosebumps just picturing it. Grandpa must have been terrified. He stayed perfectly still, praying she'd just leave. After what seemed like forever, the wheezing and scratching stopped. Grandpa counted to 100 before peeking out from under his blanket. No sign of her. The wailing started up again, distant this time as she moved back into the woods. He never saw her again after that night, but others have. About 10 years ago, a group of high school kids were partying out here in the woods, telling ghost stories around a campfire just like us. According to the one girl who made it out alive, they were joking and laughing one minute. Then the next, the wailing started. They all froze, the crackling fire the only sound between desperate cries from the darkness. A twig snapped, and out of the trees she staggered. The wailing woman just as Grandpa described. Stringy black hair, shredded white gown, yellow claws, and sunken eyes. The teens screamed and scrambled to their feet. Too late. Her unearthly speed was no match for their terror-clumsy legs. She descended on them in a blur, nails shredding through skin and bone. Blood-curdling screams echoed through the woods. The lone survivor said she managed to escape by diving into the creek and hiding underwater amongst the reeds till morning. When police arrived, no sign of the wailing woman. Just 6 mangled bodies around the ashes of the campfire. The murdered teens made headlines for weeks. Police combed these woods searching for their murderer but came up empty. They never did explain what could have inflicted such horrific injuries. Grandpa said it was the work of the wailing woman, claiming her victims out of jealousy and spite. He warned me to never camp here, never build a fire to draw her in, but I figured it's just a story, right? A branch cracks loudly, making me jump. I scan the woods surrounding our campsite. The trees cast dancing shadows across the ground in the flickering firelight. The wind picks up, rustling the leaves, almost sounding like murmuring voices. Probably just a raccoon, I tell myself. Then I heard it. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. A long, low wail, mournful and chilling. Luke's head whips around, eyes wide. He hears it too. We stand perfectly still, straining our ears. There it is again, a little louder this time. The cry of anguish echoes through the trees, rising and falling like waves. Luke grabs a flashlight and shines it into the woods. The beam catches something white fluttering behind a tree. I gasp. Luke lets out a shout. The wailing stops abruptly. Oh God, heavy wheezing replaces it, accompanied by dragging footsteps. The leaves crunch slowly like brittle bones. Crack, crunch, drag, crack, crunch, drag. The footsteps circle the campsite. I can't tell where they're coming from now. The wheezing and crackling leaves seem to surround us. I whip my head side to side, searching for the source through the darkness. Luke grips my arm so tight it hurts. I met his terrified eyes with my own. A scratching sound comes from right behind us. We both freeze. Something scrapes at the bark of the tree, like 5 long knives. I feel the blood drain from my face. Luke's breathing becomes ragged, hot and damp against my neck. The scratching stops. A chill washes over me, radiating from just over my shoulder. The wheezing turns to a rattling inhale. I make the mistake of glancing back. There stands the wailing woman, black hair veiling her face, impossibly tall and spindly. Her head inches toward mine. The rancid smell of earth and decay floods my senses. I open my mouth to scream, but only a silent whimper escapes. Those sunken, soulless eyes beneath matted hair pierce my heart with dread. She's found us. I know I shouldn't be telling you this, but you need to know about the sick game that my friends and I got pulled into. We thought it was just a bit of fun at first, but it quickly became a twisted nightmare we couldn't escape. It all started on a boring Saturday night. My friends Rachel, Jake, and I were hanging around my apartment, half-heartedly watching some dumb movie. That's when I noticed something moving outside the window. I glanced over to see a person in an odd white costume hopping around the sidewalk. They were wearing a full white bunny suit, complete with a mask and floppy ears. We laughed it off, thinking it was just some weirdo in a costume, but over the next few days that white rabbit kept popping up everywhere we went. At the coffee shop, outside school, down quiet streets as we walked home, always bouncing along silently in our periphery before vanishing again. After a week of this, I got a strange email with no subject, just a link to click. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. A web page loaded showing a cartoon white rabbit. The words, "Follow me," flashed in pulsating colors. Then my phone dinged with a text containing an address nearby and nothing else. When I told my friends, we laughed nervously. Were we really about to follow this weird game some stranger set up? But the mystery was too tempting. We had to know what would happen if we followed the white rabbit. That night we walked to the address, a rundown building on a deserted block. The place was covered in creepy graffiti, mostly of staring eyes and sharp teeth. As soon as we approached, the door swung open seemingly on its own. Rachel shivered next to me as we ventured inside. The rabbit led us on a bizarre scavenger hunt through increasingly unsettling locations across town: abandoned hospitals, decrepit tunnels, and hidden basements. At each one, we'd find a clue leading to the next, accompanied by unnerving symbols and messages, like we were being indoctrinated into some freaky cult. Things got truly terrifying the night the rabbit led us to an ominous black van parked downtown. As we approached, the doors swung open and several figures in elaborate animal masks jumped out, grabbing us and shoving us inside. I struggled violently, but they injected me with something that made my body go limp. I drifted in and out of consciousness, getting blurred glimpses of dark rooms and leering masks. I could hear Rachel crying softly nearby. At some point, I awoke to find us each chained by our necks in a rank basement. The rabbit cryptically said we passed some test and would now be rewarded. They forced us to don the masks and costumes ourselves, to become nameless ephemeral agents carrying out the cult's twisted will. Our identities were erased, and our free will was consumed by the game. We were slaves to the rabbit now, just like all the other hollow-eyed puppets in the masks. So please, if you see that white rabbit bouncing along, don't follow it. Run far away and don't look back. Or you too may end up trapped in their evil game, forced to lure others into the darkness. I barely escaped with my life, and my mind hangs by a fragile thread. But now that I've shared its secrets, I fear the rabbit is already hopping my way again. Now, I don't want to frighten anyone, but I feel I must tell you about the cornfield on Old Mill Road. It's been the source of many ghost stories and strange happenings in our town for decades. My grandfather used to warn me to never ever go near that cornfield, especially at night. But I was young and foolish back then. Old Mill Road is just on the outskirts of town, past the old sawmill that closed down years ago. Lining the cracked and pitted road are farms and cornfields stretching for acres. But there's one field in particular, sitting right on a sharp bend in the road, that fills me with dread every time I pass it. Folks around here will swear that there's something unnatural about that corn. In the summer months, when the corn is high and green, you can hear the stalks whispering to each other even when there's not a breath of wind. And sometimes, on real quiet nights, you can hear what sounds like a child laughing and playing deep within the rows of corn. But it's not a joyful kind of laugh. It's the kind of laugh that makes you shudder right to your core. No one can really explain the stories that have come from that field over the past 80 years or so. My grandfather remembered back when he was a young man how a farmhand disappeared in there one night. They organized a big search party with lanterns when he didn't come home, calling his name up and down the rows, but they never did find a trace of him or figure out what made him abandon his family and home. Then back in the 1950s, there was a group of teenagers who decided to party in that cornfield one night. Folks say they were drunk and acting foolish, breaking corn stalks and whooping loudly. But then their shouts and laughter suddenly stopped. It wasn't till the next morning that 2 of their bodies were found between the rows. No one could tell how they died. They had no injuries or markings. The only clue was their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror. The other 2 teens were never seen or heard from again. The worst incident was back in the 1970s, when a young couple went walking through that cornfield on their way home from a school dance. They never made it out to the other side. For weeks, people searched the cornfield from top to bottom, but found nothing. Then late one night, old Ed Miller was driving by and claimed he saw 2 figures emerge from the cornfield and walk stiffly across the road. He swore it was the missing teens, only they moved like puppets on a string, faces blank. He watched them disappear into the darkness before he sped all the way home and locked his doors. Those are just a few of the chilling stories. Whatever haunts that field, it seems to draw people in, then swallow them up without a trace. I think I finally understand why my grandfather warned me away. But I didn't believe in ghosts back then. Not until one hot July night during the summer I turned 17. Some friends and I had been hanging out late down by the creek on the edge of town. We were chatting and carrying on, not paying much attention to the time. That's when we realized it was past midnight already. Now the only way back into town was Old Mill Road, and we'd have to pass the cornfield. I tried to keep cool and act brave in front of my friends, but my heart was beating double time as we got our bikes and started down that cracked and pitted road. The cornfield looked endless in the moonlight, a black ocean of stalks gently swaying and rustling despite the still air. As we rode by, the whispers from the corn seemed to grow louder, replacing the crickets and peepers. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up when I heard it, a child's laugh echoing softly through the field. My friends heard it too, and we picked up speed. But then came the voices calling out to us. "Come play with us," they said. "Just for a little while." My friends panicked, pedaling hard past the cornfield. But something made me slow down and glance back over my shoulder. There, standing at the edge of the field, was a little boy with straw-colored hair, wearing old-fashioned overalls. He smiled and waved, then turned and disappeared into the rows of corn. Without thinking, I stopped my bike. I could just make out the glow of his lantern flickering amidst the stalks as he headed deeper into the field. I don't know why I did it, but I found myself dumping my bike in the ditch and hurrying into the corn after him. The whispers and leaves brushing my arms raised goosebumps, but I kept pushing through, trying to keep the little boy's lantern in view. I called to him, but he just giggled and moved further away each time. Eventually, I found myself in a little clearing, the corn rising high all around. The air felt heavy and close. The boy was nowhere to be seen now, but I could still hear echoes of his eerie giggle. Then, from somewhere in the cornfield came screams. Terrified, tortured screams that curdled my blood. It was my friends' voices, screaming my name over and over, pleading for help. But they seemed to come from all directions. I spun around wildly, screaming back, searching for the way out. But the rows were endless mazes in every direction. The screams turned to sobbing, begging me not to leave them in this horrible place. I ran through the stalks blindly as they clawed at my skin and clothes. Finally, I burst out onto Old Mill Road and stumbled right into my grandfather's arms. He was pale and shaking. Said he saw us all ride by, then came to look when I didn't show up at home. As he held me tight, I glanced back at the seemingly innocent cornfield. I could still hear faint laughing and whispers, but never again did I hear the voices of my friends. Grandfather eventually sold that field, and no corn has grown in it since. The stalks won't take to the soil anymore, he says. But sometimes at dusk, as the shadows lengthen, I think I see a little boy with a lantern wandering through the overgrown field, still searching for someone to come play with him among those demon stalks. Well, I really hope I didn't give anyone nightmares with that story. I'm sure it's just an old rural legend, nothing to actually be scared of. Anyway, I don't think I'll be taking any more late-night walks down Old Mill Road, just to be safe. Let me know if you ever see that little boy out there.